Afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the first David S. Saurman Provocative Lecture for the fall of 2013. My name's Jack Estel, and I'm a lecturer here in the economics department. So before I go any further, let's all take a minute and get out our electronic friends and put them on stun. Oh, yeah, there we go. So we can get through this interesting lecture without any interruptions. Also, I would like to welcome everyone over to Flames after this lecture is over. Flames is located on the northeast corner of 4th Street in San Fernando. We'll be having a meeting of what we call the Barstool Economists there. Everyone is welcome, and we encourage you to come over and join us. We like to share stories there and take the discussion tonight about the travels of a T-shirt further there. So please feel free to join us. This lecture series started 12 years ago to foster our vision of higher education, challenging ideas and developing critical thinking in an environment of respectful intellectual intercourse. Intercourse? Did I say that? Discourse. Sorry. Darn it. As we've said before, I hope you'll sit down, relax, enjoy, ponder these ideas. Professor Rivoli will be discussing her experiences following the life of a T-shirt. We will provide a question and answer period at the end of the presentation to allow the audience to explore their own ideas. And it's our hope that this lecture series will allow a more thorough understanding of the topics that we present in these lectures and a greater appreciation for well-reasoned, diverse ideas and opinions. By the way, our next lecture will be on October the 1st, which is a Tuesday, and James Tooley will be here. I usually do this at the end, but unfortunately when I do that, I miss some of the students. So James Toomey will be here. He is the director of the E.G. West Center at Newcastle University, and he will be discussing how the world's poorest are educating themselves. So before I go any further, I know the economics club would like to come up and make a few comments. So can you join us here, please?
Hey guys, how's it going? I'm John Linford. I'm the secretary of the Econ Club. This is my fam. She's the president of the club. She'd be the one talking to you, but she's lost her voice, so wish her better. We're the economics club here on campus. We are really everything that you could think of that has to do with econ. We have a lot of really fun events going on this year. We're hoping to plan a big debate to get a lot of people interested in that. We're also trying to do a lot of philanthropy work. We're currently doing a school supply drive for Lowell Elementary that's just right here down the street. So drop on by DMH 139, donate any extra supplies you have. We're also looking to do a lot of really fun stuff. Every couple of weeks, we pick an article, and we meet up, and we have some good food, and we talk about it, and all of its economic implications and that kind of stuff. Really casual, just fun, good way to get to know people. We're totally free as well, so come check us out, have some fun. If you're looking for some flyers or anything like that, more information for our Facebook, our Twitter, our website, come see me. I'll be right here down at the front right after this. I've got a bunch of flyers that has all of the information you could possibly want from us.
Also, we have information about our club, our types of events everywhere throughout the department. So if you just look for brochures that we hang out right outside DMH 139 or the department office, you can gain information like that, or you can search for us on Facebook, Twitter. We have a website as well. So don't miss out on this opportunity to gain valuable, exclusive networks. We can help you look for internships, anything academic, social, and professional related. So we don't want to take much of your time because we have a very great speaker here today who we've had the pleasure of having lunch with earlier today, Ms. Pietra Rivoli. So thank you, and we hope to see you throughout the semester. It's going to be great.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, John. So for you upper division and graduate students, if you have not figured it out yet, that it is best to form groups. And when you get in a work environment, you'll find that most of your work is done in small groups. I encourage you to think about the Econ Club as a way of finding like-minded people who can help you with your studies. So I would like to welcome Pietra Rivoli here tonight. Pietra teaches finance and international business in the undergraduate, graduate, and executive programs at Georgetown University. She has special interests in social justice issues and international business and in China, and she regularly leads an MBA residency program to China. Her academic research has been published in numerous leading journals, including the Journal of International Business Studies, Business Ethics Quarterly, and the Journal of Money, Credit, and Banking. In 2006, Professor Rivoli was awarded the Faculty Pioneer Award by the Aspen Institute. This award recognizes business school faculty who have been leaders in the integration of social and environmental issues in MBA curricula. Professor Rivoli's book, Travels of a T-Shirt, has received numerous awards and has been translated into 14 different languages. In it, she has personalized what most of us think of as a big idea, international trade. Our first impression here is often of factories, huge conglomerates shipping sea, land containers around the world. But within that massive movement of goods rests an untold story that Professor Rivoli decided to research. How do the individuals who actually make up this vast enterprise actually act, and how do they feel? She follows the lifespan of just a single simple product, a T-shirt, from inception through all of the hands that it passes. It is these people's stories that put the face on global trade. Let's hear what Professor Rivoli has to say about the lives that she found and that she recorded. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation to come to San Jose State, and thank you also very much for coming to listen to this talk. I've been a professor for 30 years. I just passed my 30-year mark on August 1st, and I've had a wonderful career teaching in business school. But I have to say that the most fun thing that I did in that career was writing this book. When I finished the book, I guess I sort of thought that the fun was over, but what I learned is that there was a whole other set of fun to be had because I would get the privilege of traveling around and talking to people about this project and about the very interesting ideas. So one of my favorite things to do now is to come to travel and to talk to groups like you who have an interest in this topic. Okay. The book, The Travels of a T-Shirt in the Global Economy, is a biography. And as you know, a biography is just a life story. And so rather than telling the life story of a person, in this book I tell the life story of a very simple product. Okay? And it's not a generic product or the story of some T-shirt somewhere. It's the story of a very particular T-shirt, and in fact I brought it to show to you. This is the T-shirt that I wrote the book about. And what you notice is just how unremarkable it is. It cost $6, and it is probably just like any number of the dozens that you have in your drawers at home, in fact, that I see a lot of you wearing out there. So the idea is to take this very simple and specific product and see what its life story can teach us about much more complicated issues. Okay? This isn't a typical approach in economics. Normally in economics we study things by looking at data instead of actual people or actual products. But the idea that a biography can inform or help us to understand more complicated things is, of course, very common in fields such as history, right? So you might study, for example, the biography of a soldier or of Abraham Lincoln, and through that you understand something about the Civil War that you didn't understand before. So my premise was really exactly that. Can the biography of this simple product teach us something about economic and political globalization that we didn't really understand before? Of course, the first question I usually get is, well, why a T-shirt? Why not an iPhone or a car or some other thing? Okay. The answer to that question is very simple. I picked a T-shirt because about 14 years ago now, there was a wave of anti-globalization protests. You might remember a year or two ago we had the protests in New York and Washington about the 1%. Okay? And then a couple years before that, there were protests when the big banks were bailed out on Wall Street. So, protests related to issues that are themselves related to some kind of aspect of economic injustice or unfairness, these are a fairly common part of our landscape in the United States. And back in 1999, the protests that were kind of coursing through the country as well as the world came to be known as anti-globalization protests. And so we had big protests that drew thousands and thousands of people, and they were so big that they actually succeeded in shutting down some of the big meetings that were going on. They shut down the meeting of the World Trade Organization in Seattle. They shut down a meeting of the World Bank and the IMF in Washington, and so forth. So what I'm explaining is sort of an outpouring of passion on this topic of globalization, and in particular, passion against the idea of globalization, international markets, international trade. Okay. At the same time, there was on college campuses, including my own, a kind of sub-movement going on. Okay? And I've been in a university a very long time, so I have seen a lot of campus activism. So, for example, I remember very clearly the activism in the 1980s against apartheid in South Africa. I remember activism against the war when the United States first invaded Iraq and so forth. But at this point in time, the activism was kind of a subset of the anti-globalization movement, and it was targeted at sweatshops. And our students were basically saying, we have these T-shirts that say Georgetown University across the front, and we have really no control or no knowledge about the conditions, especially the working conditions, under which this apparel was produced. And if the apparel is going to have our school's name on it, then, we want to have some assurances that the apparel was not made in sweatshops, okay? And I'll put aside for a moment the complicated, question of what that word means. My university is a Jesuit school, and the leadership of the university decided that, this was an important topic, and it was an important learning opportunity for both the faculty and the students. And so we decided to start to try to talk about, how we could address this. How could we figure out where these T-shirts came from? How could we figure out whether the workers that produced them were treated well? How could we figure out if there was anything at all that, we could do about it? And what I realized as we started to have these conversations is that, almost everybody involved was speaking from a position of ignorance. So even though I knew, a lot about the theory of international trade, I really had no idea where the T-shirts came from. I had no idea what an apparel factory looked like and so forth, and neither did the students. And so this was the moment, really, when I decided that, an important path toward understanding more might be to actually try to trace this life story. If I could actually go from the beginning to the end and kind of see all of the places and all of the conditions and all of the people that were part of this T-shirt's life, then maybe that would, help us all take a step toward a further understanding of this phenomenon that we call globalization. So that is exactly what I set out to do with this T-shirt. I picked up the T-shirt in Florida on vacation one day, and I started to investigate I started, literally with the tag in the back of the shirt. There was a company's name on it, and so I got in touch with that company, and that company helped me get in touch with, their suppliers, and I kind of uncovered this life story step by step. And then I went to all of the places that the T-shirt went. So to give you just a summary of the T-shirt's life story, you can take a look at this map. Okay? So this is kind of the biographical highlights of the T-shirt story as I uncovered it. Okay? So what you see here is, T-shirts start out as a plant. They start out as a cotton plant. And my T-shirt is a cheap T-shirt, a $6 T-shirt. And so what that means is that it is made of cheap cotton. Some of you out there have on nice plush T-shirts. That cotton might have come from, the Pima cotton of California or the nicer cotton that comes from the Mississippi Valley. But for cheap T-shirts, you have a particular kind of cotton, and the biggest producer of that kind of cotton in the world is the region of West Texas that surrounds Lubbock. So I went to Lubbock to try to learn what I could about how this global cotton industry worked, because that was obviously where the T-shirt's life began. And I spent time there trying to understand how the business worked, how the economics worked, and how Lubbock, as a big cotton-producing region, was connected to the rest of the global economy. Now, we produce very little apparel anymore in the United States. Over 98% of the clothing that you and I buy in the U.S. is imported, over 98%. So that cotton that we grow in Texas really has no reason to stay in the United States. Instead, it is shipped off to countries that are making the apparel or the textiles or the yarn. In the case of my T-shirt, the cotton traveled all the way to China, okay? And in particular to factories around Shanghai. And in Shanghai, I went to visit the factory, first of all, that took the raw cotton and spun it into yarn. Okay? And then a second factory took that yarn and knit it into fabric, and that same factory turned the fabric into a T-shirt. Now, this map is already, at least that part of the map, the China part of the map, is already out of date. Because very little apparel production now takes place around Shanghai. Okay? At the time, quite a bit did, and also further south in China. But now, the apparel industry has left Shanghai for the same reason that it left the United States, and that is the increase in the labor costs. Okay? But at the time, again, that part of China was a big producer of T-shirts for the world market. So I then went to China and, tried to do the same thing that I did with the cotton part of the story, which is just to understand, how this business worked, how these businesses competed, what it was like to be in the textile or the fabric or the apparel industry in China as a company, as a country, as a worker. Then the next chapter in the T-shirt's life is, of course, it comes all the way back to the United States as a T-shirt. Now, when you look at these little dotted lines, going across the globe, one thing that you should be aware of is that as these goods cross oceans, they have to do so in conformance with a very complicated set of trade rules and trade policies. Okay? And so the next thing that I started to study were exactly that, those rules. How easy or how difficult or what did it take if you're a Chinese T-shirt? What does it take to get into the United States? And it turns out it's a fairly complicated process because even now, with the United States not being much of a textile producer at all, you still have political pressures in the United States to keep out goods like this, particularly if they come from China. So another part of the book was, trying to study those rules, the political origins of the rules, and so forth. Okay. The final part of my T-shirt's life story is always, to people who read the book, the most surprising one, because most people don't realize that there is an enormous and very vigorous global trade in used clothing. Okay. So if you think about all of the T-shirts, I would bet if I asked you, say, how many people in this room have too many T-shirts? Raise your hand. Okay. So that's most of us. We feel like we have too many of these things, right? What do we do when we have too many? Well, we tend to give them away, right? We give them away to charity. We give them away to Goodwill or Salvation Army. And what happens then is that those T-shirts that we give away to the Salvation Army are bundled up and sold to clothing and textile recyclers. The one that I studied was in New York. And then those recyclers sort the clothing and grade it and bale it up, and then they ship it, all over the world. So because you and I have so much surplus clothing, that creates a supply for which there's really no demand here in the United States. And so you have the creation of this global trade. So that is, in a nutshell, the life story of my T-shirt. What you can see here is, of course, it is a very global story. If I had gone to write this book in about any time up to about 1985, the map would not look like this at all. And in fact, if I were in 1985, this whole process from the cotton to the spinning to the apparel production all would have taken place somewhere in the American South. At that point, the apparel industry, the textile industry, had not globalized at all. Okay? So if I were to have written it in 1985, it would have looked much different. If I were to write it today, it would look different again. Because as I mentioned, the apparel industry in China is still there, and it's still doing pretty well, but it's no longer competitive in these low-end items like T-shirts. Okay? Now, one of the things that I've become very accustomed to is strong reactions of one kind or another to this picture, because many people, essentially look at this picture and see a rather scary and threatening world. Okay? Now, I will say there are also people, especially business people and economists, who look at the picture and see a very kind of a happy story. But I guess you can look at this picture and you can see creation of various kinds. You can see all of these industries, all of these businesses, all of these trade flows creating jobs, creating money, creating prosperity. Okay? But you could also look at the picture and see, instead of creation, you could see destruction. You'd say, well, what about all the jobs that were lost, in the U.S. apparel industry, all these jobs that moved to China, for example? So the point is that you're looking at a picture here of something that we call globalization, right? And people have both positive and negative perspectives on the notion of globalization. Okay? Now, these very polarized views, some people feeling very threatened and seeing destruction, other people more optimistic and seeing creation. These polarized views are not new by any stretch of the imagination. One of the things I did when I was researching the book is I decided to kind of go back in time and ask the question, well, how have people felt about this in the past? And I found some really interesting ideas, some interesting thought leadership, if you will, going back many, many centuries. Okay? So this is St. Augustine speaking in about 400 AD. And if you read this quote, you'll see that he is fearful of economic globalization. In fact, he talks about it in a way that people used to talk about whether something was good or bad, and that was whether or not it was God's will. Okay? So St. Augustine is saying God did not mean for us to make money from the ocean. We're not supposed to use it for commerce. We're not supposed to have those dotted lines going back and forth across the map with trading goods or trading services. He's saying you should fear that, and instead you should use the ocean just to go fishing, right? Just to go fishing. So this very, very long time ago, you had one of the thought leaders being opposed to international trade, being opposed to the idea of exchange of goods among countries. Okay? And I think it's important for us to kind of think about, well, what was he worried about, or what was he afraid of? Okay? And I'll come back to that. Okay? But at about the same time, you had another philosopher, Libanius, and what he is saying is something much, much different. He's saying that, look, God didn't put one thing over there or one thing over there so that we wouldn't trade. The reason that different countries, have different goods is he thinks that's all a part of God's plan. Because if you put oranges in one country and lemons in another, then we're going to trade with one another and get to know one another, and we'll cultivate, as he says, a social relationship with one another. And he said God actually called international trade into being for that purpose, so that we would have a reason to kind of talk to one another and get along. Okay? And it shouldn't matter where some good was produced as long as we can trade with one another. So the point in showing you this, again, is to just illustrate, these tensions that people feel about the topic of globalization. The polarizing views are part of a long history. Okay? Now, one of the mistakes that I made when I started thinking about this is, since my training is in business and economics, I really didn't understand very well, I think, the opposition to international trade. Because according to economics, free trade is almost always the best policy. Okay? And the reason it's the best policy, and this goes back to the idea of comparative advantage, or Adam Smith, is that the idea is just, every country should specialize in whatever it's particularly good at, and then trade with other countries, and that way we will have the highest level of economic activity and the highest level of economic output. Okay? So the economic view of free trade is pretty, unambiguous. Okay? Now, why would somebody argue against that? The main reason that I used to think there were objections was simply because even though globalization and free trade is best for the economy as a whole, as soon as you start to open up the world to international competition, there will be people and companies and communities who will lose out. So, for example, if I used to have an apparel factory in Alabama, and now all the clothing is coming from China, and my apparel company goes bankrupt, well, then I have been a loser in this big game of international trade, and it would make sense, it would be rational for me to be opposed to globalization, opposed to trade. Now, the mistake that I made was in thinking about international trade is my assumption was that the opposition to international trade, the people who were against globalization, those were the people who somehow had lost from the opening of markets. There were people like the apparel factory owner or the worker in the apparel factory. And of course, it makes sense that they would be opposed to trade, but there's a solution, if you will, for them, and that's that, we can try to compensate them for what they lost. We can try to retrain them for other jobs. Okay? But what I now understand is that there is quite a bit of opposition to globalization, quite a bit of hesitation about topics related to trade, even from people who are winners, so to speak. Even from people who haven't lost their jobs. And in fact, even from people who are beneficiaries. Okay? So the conclusion that I drew was that when you kind of scratch the surface to figure out, what is it that people are really worried about? What is it that people are opposed to? Okay. What you find is not so much people who have been economically threatened, but instead you find people who, for one reason or another, have concerns about fairness and justice in the global economy. Okay? And this is a topic, fairness and justice, that is, this is kind of what philosophers talk about, not economists. And so one of the things that the economists, are not very good at is figuring out how to integrate discussions of fairness and justice into discussions. Okay? So let me now talk a bit about both the economic forces that caused the T-shirt's life to turn out the way it did, but also to try to elucidate some of these concerns about ethics and fairness. And I'll do that by introducing you to some of the people in the T-shirt's life story. Okay. So you can probably guess from the pictures up here which ones are the cotton farmers. Okay. Not that hard to figure out. Okay. And these people are essentially just the people that were involved in the T-shirt's life, sort of chapter by chapter. Okay. So on your upper left are Nelson and Ruth Reinsch, who have a large cotton growing operation in West Texas. Okay. West Texas, as I said, is the leader in the production of a certain kind of cotton in the world. Okay. And so it's an interesting question for me as a business professor. Why is that? Why do the West Texans kind of win at this global game? Okay. And there's a lot of reasons. They have exceptionally good technology. They have, the farmers are very well educated and they know how to use the technology. There is a great deal of very sound science behind the breeding of cotton in this region. They have control in a very effective way over pests. They have control over weeds. They have amazing machines that are able to pick and clean the cotton in such a way that the textile mills in China say, you know, we really like that U.S. cotton. We really like that West Texas cotton. They also have an incredible entrepreneurial spirit in West Texas. So when you go to West Texas and you go to the cotton farms or the cotton gins or the cotton merchants, so forth and so on, what really strikes you is wow, these are very, very smart business people. Okay? And so you kind of say, well, that's why they're winning. And that seems like it's okay. It seems like it's fair. It seems like they sort of deserve to win. But there's a piece of the cotton story that is problematic when we think about issues of fairness. Cotton is a global commodity. It's produced in something like 80 countries in the world, okay? And it's produced in very poor countries, in fact, some of the very poorest countries in the world, as well as some of the richest countries, such as Australia and the United States. Okay? What happens with cotton in the United States, along with other what we call big row crops, which are wheat, corn, rice, soy, okay, is that we have, since the Great Depression, very big subsidy programs associated with those particular crops. Okay? And in fact, when I was writing this book, there was some research that estimated that about a third of the cotton farmers' income in the United States was the result of federal subsidies, a third of their income. Okay? Now, if you think about that, then you kind of have to conclude that, well, they're doing really well for lots of good reasons, but they've also got this other kind of edge against the cotton-producing countries in the poorer part of the world. Because if you think about, what the effect of these subsidies, well, if I'm getting all these subsidies, then I'm going to grow more cotton. And so what happens as the result of these subsidies is that the world supply of cotton goes up. And if that happens, the market price of the cotton goes down. And that affects all of the farmers in the poor countries that are trying to sell their cotton in the global market. So what you can conclude, kind of, is that if you are a farmer, a cotton farmer from Brazil or from Africa, and these are the ones that were most vocal about it, that there's something about this game that's just not fair, right? There's something about this that's just not fair. And so even though the World Trade Organization has ruled against the subsidies, even though a lot of people would agree they're kind of not fair, they persist and they persist and they persist. So what sometimes people are objecting to, when they think about how world trade works, are things like this, okay, where it looks like the game is sort of stacked in favor of one player or another, okay? And so when we talked to people during the anti-globalization protests back then, among the loudest protesters, were those who were protesting on behalf of these poorer countries against the cotton subsidies. And, one of the reasons I think that makes this most salient is, again, because countries in the west coast of Africa, some of the poorest countries, Malawi, Mali, and so forth, are very, very dependent on income from selling cotton into the world market. So that's just an example of a fairness, story that comes out of my T-shirt's life. And it gives you some sense of why people could have a problem with this life story from the perspective of justice or fairness. Okay? If you go down to the lower left, this young woman, her name is He Wan-ji, and she is working in the apparel factory in Shanghai, and she's operating a cutting machine that cuts the T-shirt fabric into pieces. Okay? So if you think about what it takes to get from being a plant to being a T-shirt, the first step is yarn spinning, and that is mostly done by machine with very, very few people involved now in most parts of the world. So it uses a lot of machines, but not very many people. The second part is turning that yarn into fabric. That is also very capital intensive, not many people involved. But as soon as it's time to turn the fabric into apparel, you have a very labor-intensive process. And that is why, in the globalized world that we have today, the production of apparel tends to gravitate towards low-wage countries. Okay? And that's why, at the time, this production was taking place in China. So economic forces essentially push the production of apparel to low-wage countries, especially low-wage countries where labor is plentiful. Okay? Now, this is really a story of economic benefits for everybody because the employment is going to countries that need the employment, that create jobs for people like Hiwanji, where she might not have one otherwise. But there's also an economic benefit to us, of course, because when that apparel production flows to the low-wage countries, we get the benefit of the lower-priced apparel. So the economic story is a fairly happy one, but once again, when you scratch the surface and start to listen to people, there is also some hesitation, some opposition to the way this works, in particular associated with working conditions in many apparel factories around the world. So the word sweatshop, we associate with apparel production, don't we? We think of the word sweatshop and we think of some poor woman at a sewing machine with a very low wage and unsafe conditions and unfair treatment and so forth. Okay? In the most, recent awful example of this, of course, was the collapse of the apparel factory, the Rana Plaza in Bangladesh back in April. That was an apparel factory where more than 1,000 people, mostly women who were sewing apparel, were killed. So on the one hand, you have a sort of happy economic story of jobs and prosperity and producing goods for Western consumers, but on the other hand, associated with that are conditions that many people simply find, morally unacceptable, morally objectionable, and they can be traced, right, directly to this phenomenon of international trade and globalization. So I don't have to be, an apparel worker in Alabama who's lost my job to have concerns or objections to some of the practices in this industry. And I think if you kind of listen to what people are concerned about, you do hear more and more concerns about the process and the conditions under which goods are produced in the global economy. And apparel is always a top example. Okay? On the lower right, you have an interesting collection of guys. You probably can't guess what they're about. These guys, each one of them is from a different country. Okay? Bangladesh, Turkey, the United States, Sri Lanka. They're each from a different country, and they are all lobbyists. In other words, they are involved in the industry association for the textile industry in their country. So you have the guy who's, president of the Textile Industry Association in the United States. Same thing in Turkey, so forth and so on. They gathered together, okay, for a meeting, okay, and this meeting where the picture was taken, it was called because they got together and said, we're really worried about China kind of taking everybody's lunch. What should we do about that? That was the purpose of this meeting. Because at the time, China's exports were growing in apparel at something like 30% a year. Factories were closing in all of these countries. So these guys get together and say, okay, what do we do? What do we do about this? The answer that groups like this typically come up with is, we need to try to figure out, if you think about a faucet and it's kind of pouring in T-shirts from China, these guys are coming up with an answer that has to do with, how do you turn the faucet off, or at least how do you slow it down? And there's all kinds of ways that you can do that, and there are all kinds of barriers, in other words, that you can put in place to redirect trade from one place to another. But as soon as you do that, okay, once again, I would say you can't escape the discussions of fairness. Okay, so I'll give you some examples. You have heard of NAFTA, which opened up trade between the U.S. and Mexico and Canada, or CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, which opened up trade between the U.S. and Central American countries. Okay? Really, these agreements all, are usually controversial because the rules, when you read the agreements, are designed always to protect one group or protect another group. It's never just, let's just trade with Mexico. If I had a free trade agreement with Mexico that was really a free trade agreement, then it only needs to be 1 page long. We'll let your goods in, you let our goods in. But instead, if you look at the NAFTA agreement, it's like 3 feet, tall, and it's guys like this, who write these rules in incredibly complicated ways to protect their own position. So, for example, in the NAFTA and CAFTA agreements, we say that, okay, you can sell us T-shirts, pay no import duty, okay? However, the yarn has to be from either this country or that country or this country, the yarn that you make the T-shirt out of. So if you're going to sell us a T-shirt, Mexico, it can't be made of Chinese yarn or Vietnamese yarn. These crazy rules, okay, are embedded in our trading system. And it is always, I think, very clear when you look at the rules that they are made through a wheeling and dealing process that is often judged, I think, correctly, not to be fair. Okay? And this is just part of a bigger issue that you hear about every day on the news, which is how special interests, affect our political process. Okay. The final part of the story on the upper right, this is Jeffrey Malonge, and this is his used T-shirt store, his stall in Tanzania. Okay. And this is where a great percentage of our used clothing ends up, in Tanzania and on the east coast of Africa in particular. Okay? And he is selling these T-shirts that we have thrown away. And he's selling them at the time for something like $1 a piece. Okay? And this also, has a very clear economic logic to it. Again, we're throwing away lots of T-shirts. People there need the clothing, and so it seems like a perfect set of circumstances to lead to a mutually beneficial trade. But people, of course, have issues with this trade also from a moral perspective. The thing that seems to bother people the most when I talk to them is people say, well, wait a minute, I gave that clothing to charity. It's not right that somebody is then selling it. Okay? That's one thing that bothers people. Another thing that bothers people is that as long as we are, sending these thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds of our used clothing into a market like Tanzania's, it's going to be very difficult for them to develop their own textile and apparel industry. So once again, you have an economic logic that explains what the map looks like, but you have concerns about fairness and justice. So the point that I'm trying to make is that at every stage in my T-shirt's life, at every part of that map, there's an economic logic that explains why things happened in a certain place. But at every stage, there are also concerns about whether this whole game is fair, there are concerns about whether moral issues are being addressed in the way that they should be. One of the things that you probably know about human nature, and I guess always knew it, but it's become a lot more clear to me, is that we are all programmed somehow to be thinking about fairness. Okay? Our brain naturally goes there. You know, if something happens to you in a class, you know, you're graded this way or that way, you think about, well, is that fair? If something happens to you in your family, you know, compared to your siblings, your brain automatically goes, is that fair? Look at kids in a nursery school in the sandbox. You know, that's what they're always screaming, right? You know, that's not fair. You know, that's mine. We think that way, and I think that it's very kind of deeply embedded in the way that we approach life, is we judge things on the basis of fairness. And we are always making these moral judgments, okay? And as I said at the beginning, economists don't really know what to do with that part of the human psyche. You know, we don't really have analytical tools or frameworks to talk about that. But I think that we have to start to think about these things and talk about them, because we can't bring people on board with an agenda of globalization or free trade unless we address concerns about fairness. Okay? So the big lesson, you know, for me in looking at this T-shirt's life is that, you know, this opposition to globalization is not just about economics. It's not even mostly about economics. Okay? It's about these other issues related to under this umbrella of fairness. But at the same time, I would also say that the proponents, the people who are in favor of globalization and free trade, they also have some things on their side that are not just about economics too. Okay? And this goes back to one of our thinkers from the 5th century. Okay? So, you know, as a business school professor, I do believe in the economics of global commerce and its prospects to improve the world. Okay? But I also learned in all of my traveling, okay, that one of the most effective ways for countries, different cultures, different religions, to start to understand each other better was to develop commercial relationships, was to develop trade relationships. If you think about, you know, what does it take to do business with somebody? You know, it takes trust. I have to believe you're going to pay me. I have to believe you're going to send me the T-shirts you promised. It takes open communication. Okay? It takes cooperation. And if you think about these words, you know, trust, communication, cooperation, you know, these are all happy words, right? These are things that we want more of in our world that is often very polarized by culture or race or religion or what have you. So I think on the positive side, one of the things that I learned, and you can even see it just looking at these faces up on the screen here, this T-shirt has caused all kinds of different people to interact with one another who never would have otherwise. Okay? The last thing that I'll say as a big lesson for me as I made my way through this project is the people who got me started on this whole thing looked like this. Okay? I remember these protests back in about 2000. These pictures were from Washington, from Seattle, and you can see they're marching against the World Trade Organization. They're opposing international trade, the IMF, so forth and so on. Okay? And as I mentioned, you know, we have kind of waves of these that went on in the past 10 years in other places as well. I have to say that, what I now understand, again, is that a lot of this was motivated by various concerns about fairness. Okay? But the other thing that I learned is that a lot of times, these folks at the time seemed to me like they were a little bit crazy. Like, what are you talking about? I would watch TV and I would kind of, I'd have that reaction. But now with hindsight, when I look back, what I realize is that when you have people who have passionate opposition to things, who have passionate positions, such that they are making this kind of commotion, this kind of noise, okay? This is often, whether we like it or not, this is often what it takes to get certain kinds of things to change. Okay? So if you look at American industrial history, for example, and you look at things like OSHA, the Occupational Health and Safety Office, federal office, or you look at things like fire safety, or you look at things like building codes in factories, or you look at things like protection from different kinds of toxins. Often this progress was the result of somebody making a pretty big stink. And as I look back at the past 10 years at kind of what has changed, I do give a lot of credit to the folks who started me off on this project, because what I realize now is a lot of the things that they were making a stink about back then are things that have now come to pass. In other words, they were successful. And most people now looking back would say the world is a better place. A simple example is, 15 years ago, it was very unusual for an apparel company to have a code of conduct. But now it's very commonplace. So that's just one simple example. So I think that these concerns about process and justice and fairness, if we listen to them carefully and then watch how industrial history progresses, you see that sooner or later the people who are making the most noise are pretty good predictors of how the practice will evolve in the future. Okay. So I will stop now, and I would be happy to take your questions. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you. If you have a question, I would be happy to entertain it. I will bring you the microphone if you hold up your hand, and when someone's speaking, if you want to speak next, I encourage you to hold up your hand and I will find you.
Here?
Okay, let me start here, and I see someone back there.
Thank you, Dr. Rivoli, for the lecture. I learned a lot from your lecture. I hear you talking about invisible hand, divisible labor, cost theorems. I hear all that in there. And this is my first year economics student, so I hear all that in your lecture. My question to you is this. I'm from Vietnam. I came here when I was 14, and I came back 10 years ago, and I saw the power of globalization, as you described in your lecture. It changed a lot. I used to live in a village where houses were made of mud and leaves, but in 2000 I went back. I saw high-rise buildings, apartments, all that stuff. But also you mentioned that there were a lot of opposition to free trade and to globalization. My question to you, what do you think is your roles of the WTO and also other regional organizations such as the ASEAN, the APEC? Mm-hmm. What can they do to push, the world toward more free trade instead of going backward?
So the question, so you started out by saying that you had come to the U.S. when you were 14? Okay, from Vietnam, and then went back more recently, and you saw the tremendous economic progress that Vietnam had made as the result of globalization. So when you left, they were at this level of economic development. You returned, they were up here. And it is correct. In the case of Vietnam, A great deal of that economic progress was due to Vietnam's engagement with the global economy, and in particular their success in exporting in a number of industries. Then your question was, what are the organizations that govern international trade, such as the World Trade Organization, as well as the different regional organizations of countries? What is their role, okay, in fostering globalization? Okay? You know, unfortunately, my own view is that these organizations have been relatively ineffective. Okay? The globalization and trade has taken place, you know, whether or not those organizations were doing their job. The World Trade Organization, for example, has been trying, I think, for 15 years to come up with kind of a set of rules that everybody agrees upon, and they have failed. And so I think that, you know, because our world is organized by nation states, you know, we tend to pay attention to the rules in our own countries. Our transnational organizations, you know, tend to have fairly weak governance and fairly limited effectiveness, particularly when it comes to matters of trade. But at the same time, I guess my conclusion is that it doesn't even matter that much, because Vietnam is increasingly engaged in the global economy, no matter what the World Trade Organization or ASEAN or any of these other bodies are doing. So I don't have a positive spin on most of what I've observed with those organizations. Okay. Other questions? Yes.
I'm wondering, you discussed the unfair situations under which, you know, some of the sweatshops operate. And my question is, based on your research, have you formed an opinion on whether this situation is actually a worse situation than if some of these people had no job at all? I understand, you know, the working conditions may be terrible, but is it still the lesser of two evils versus not having a job at all?
Well, I think in almost all cases, when the people have chosen to go to work in the factory, then we can almost say by definition it must be better than their alternative, right? Or they wouldn't have chosen it, okay? So I think that, you know, you are absolutely right. One of the problems that we have in the United States is we should not be judging things always by a certain set of standards here, because many of these women do not have other alternatives. In some countries, though, the women are actually not making the choice on their own free will. So in China, for example, generally, you know, what I saw was the women were in the village, they were not making much money, they did not have much autonomy, and they say, you know, I would rather go work in the garment factory. Okay? In some other countries, particularly right now Bangladesh, what women will tell you is that, you know, I didn't have a choice to come here. You know, my father made me come, or my older brother or something. So for me, a critical question is, was it your decision or was it someone else's? And I kind of, you know, form my opinion on that basis of whether someone is acting on their own autonomy. Other questions?
You mentioned the code of conduct that some of the companies have formed. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit as to what the code of conduct is, and if you think it's a good thing or if it's just another way to put people out of jobs in certain countries and give them to other people in other countries.
The way the codes of conduct work, and they're far from perfect, okay, but essentially, you know, if you think about you know, so you go to McDonald's and you're the customer and you buy a hamburger, okay? As the customer, can you realistically be responsible for the conditions under which the cow was raised for that hamburger? Of course not. That's a crazy idea, okay? And up until about 15 years ago, what the apparel company said was something like that. They said, you know, we're just buying We're just a customer. We're just buying T-shirts from this factory. We have no control or power over how they are produced. Okay? But what has changed is that now the major apparel companies say, okay, we do have responsibility for the things that happen back in our supply chain. Okay? And one of the ways we can take responsibility is to say, okay, if you're going to sell your T-shirts, if we're going to be your customer, then you have to agree to this code of conduct. And it will have, you know, the kinds of things that you would expect in a code of conduct. You know, we promise that people will have safe conditions. We promise they'll be paid fairly, you know, and so forth and so on. Now, I think that the trickiest part of this is the monitoring, okay? And it's very, very difficult to monitor these things. There was a great article in the New York Times last week about this. So I think the codes of conduct are well motivated. I don't think they are, you know, a trick to get something to happen or not happen. But I also think that, you know, once all the American and European countries kind of agree, you know, there's really not a competitive problem. You know, you can see why one company wouldn't want to do it all by themselves, but once it's become industry practice, you know, then a company can't say, well, we can't afford to do that. So I think it's definitely a step in the right direction, but at the same time, you know, we just have to be very aware of how difficult these things are to monitor.
One of the most challenging comments you made right now for me as an economist, I'm over here.
Okay.
Is the concept of fairness. And I'm wondering if you could give us more direction on how to operationalize that term. So from an economic standpoint, I certainly can't say that someone else's happiness is greater than someone else's misery.
Right.
And so I'm worried that we're getting caught in pursuing a goal that is not operational.
Yeah. Well, I struggle with that myself because, you know, I don't have a way to think about it based on my training. So, but what I do have is, you know, just a decade now of observing that that's how people think. And it's actually how I think too. You know, if I'm at work and I see, you know, somebody else got a bigger pay raise, you know, it's not that I need more money. That's not fair, right? And so I think that, you know, the only thing I would say is that we need to acknowledge, you know, whatever that gene is in the human race. And I don't think it makes sense to say, well, you know, the gene shouldn't be there, because it clearly is. Now, how to operationalize it in terms of decision making, I think, you know, that's, I guess, what politics is about, right? I mean, our Congress is supposed to be reflecting our overall values of justice and fairness. But I will be the first to admit that I find it very, very hard to, you know, we certainly can't have universal agreement on what fairness is. But at the same time, I guess I would also not be in favor of just closing off the discussion entirely, since it's so important to, it's such an important part, I think, of who we all are.
To what extent do you feel that codes of conduct are in fact, shall we say, the other side of lower wages, in that codes of conduct, the higher they are, then wages will be lower, and the higher the wages are, then there will be a downside to codes of conduct, insofar as workers choose the conditions and wages under which they work, which would bring me to a related point, which is that you mentioned about the increasing use of codes of conduct with reference to, say, the 1999 Seattle demands and the fact that these things have improved. To what extent would that have happened anyway in a world where we have rising real wages and workers choose to take better working conditions over higher wages at the margin, over higher money wages at the margin?
That was sort of the way I thought about it too, until I watched it in action. And I guess, when I looked back at industrial history, businesses operate, I guess like many other entities, kind of out of habit, okay? And if you ask, if you look at, when does a business make a big change? It tends to do so, clearly for profit motives, so you have a big change and you have a great new product or a big technology or something. But you don't see these kinds of leaps in management practices and in working conditions, okay? It's not that you don't see incremental gradual improvement. I think you do, especially as economic conditions improve. But if you look at how certain things change, so for example, fire exits, okay? That's not something that's necessarily related to economic development. Those kinds of things, in my observation, are related more to political activism, okay? And so, and the same thing was what happened. If you look at what happened with child labor laws, for example, in both the UK and the US, that wasn't something that was kind of a business decision over time. How they treated kids in the factories was very much in response to, religious leaders, protests, political activism, and so forth. So I do think there is a role, okay, that is independent of the overall path of economic development.
Have you read Nardinelli on child labour and industrial?
Yes, yes. Okay. Other questions? Yes.
Have you looked into how new technologies such as three-dimensional printing will affect globalization? Would that be like a reverse of the process?
The question is, how will something like three-dimensional printing affect globalization? Well, you do read and hear a lot about the reversal of globalization, production coming back, because to the extent that things can be produced without labor, then the wages don't matter as much, right? And so to the extent that you have technology that replaces people, you can expect some reversal of globalization because the production can take place here. And in fact, it's often better for it to take place here because, we have reliable electricity, we have good logistics, you don't have all these transportation costs and so forth. So I've read, a fair bit of that where people are, are talking about these reverse patterns, and I think there's probably something to it, but not in goods like apparel, where you still have that very big labor element.
Thanks for coming to San Jose State and discussing these issues. I'm looking forward to reading your book. Like you, I teach a globalization course here at San Jose State, and I also teach a course on recycling. One of the things I get concerned about, and I hear students talk about, is this concept of race to the bottom. Well, first of all, you seem to think that regulation through the trade organizations will be ineffective. Are we moving towards better regulations that will help reduce this race to the bottom and the exploitation of people and resources?
I think back to that comment, and I'm trying to remember, I want to say it was an economic minister maybe of Albania or somewhere like that, where somebody said to him, aren't you're worried as you join the global economy that, you're going to be exploited, in the race to the bottom. And he said, well, we're working very hard to get to the point where we can be exploited. We want to engage in the global economy. I think that the race to the bottom is just one of those terms that's thrown around a little bit too loosely, because if you look at the race to the bottom in a long historical context, what you have is labor-intensive production tending to want to find the low wage rates, okay? And this is the bottom. But you have, at the same time, an increase in what the bottom even means, okay? So the bottom now looks much different than the bottom 50 years ago and different than the 50 years before that and so forth. So I think that what you have simultaneously going on is a race to the bottom while at the same time the bottom is rising. Okay? And I think that that is the dynamic, that we've observed ever since the Industrial Revolution. So the bottom, in Manchester, England in the late 1700s doesn't look anything like the bottom right now. So, you certainly do not want employment not to flow to where it's needed the most. But at the same time, with the advances in technology, I think labor and labor costs by itself, they're going to be shrinking in importance as a determinant of where, of where production takes place. So I think, the best answer to the race to the bottom problem is, first of all, good politics. If you look at what happened in Rana Plaza in Bangladesh, that was an incredible failure of Bangladeshi governance. The building was built illegally. It was never inspected. There wasn't a building permit, so forth and so on. So there's a failure of governance that is, first of all, I think needs to be addressed. And, that's a question that's well beyond my pay grade, but you see it everywhere in developing countries. The people in too many countries do not have the government that they deserve. Okay? And that's, I think, a much bigger threat than the economic forces of trade. Okay?
Do we have any other questions? Okay. Wow, I'm shocked. The south end of the building hasn't done very much. Do I see any hands rising over there? I have a question for you. So
okay.
You wrote the book originally about 5 years ago. Is that true?
The first edition came out in 2005, and then another edition in 2009.
Okay. So, and is there a third edition in the works?
I don't think so.
But I know you've thought about this continuously. Can you tell me one, maybe the most positive thing that you've seen out of this, and also maybe the most negative thing that you've seen over that span of time, kind of watching this?
The most positive thing I've seen is, was I think something that I alluded to was just the incredible positive nature of the human bonds that are formed by business relationships around the world. And that's the thing that struck me over and over again. One of my very clear memories was the week of September 11th in 2001. And of course, we know the polarizing nature of, what was going on at that time. And I was talking to people who were a part of, my book. And there was there were Jewish people, and there were Muslims, and there were people from China, and they were all still talking to one another throughout that period because they had business to do. And it was then that I realized that there is this prospect, for improving the human condition through these commercial ties. I think that's the most positive thing. The most discouraging thing, a couple of discouraging things. I think all of the most discouraging things that I've observed had to do with failures of politics, okay? Where I was just, astonished at how the rules were actually getting made. Very discouraged about the various antics of the Communist Party in China, where I saw people, go to jail that I knew did not deserve to go to jail. And also, I think, very discouraged with, watching now what's happening in Bangladesh and the failure of that, of the government to be able to take care of its own people. But in the United States, we're not clean either, because watching politics in Washington can also be very discouraging. So I guess, in terms of the pluses and minuses, that's where my strongest impressions are.
I wish I had have asked you that in reverse order, I think. But on that happy note, thank you all for coming tonight. And thanks. Let's have a nice hand for Professor Rivoli.
Thank you.